Syrian government troops have recaptured about 3/4 of Aleppo territory once held by rebels, putting Bashar al-Assad the closest he's been to an absolute victory there in 4 years. US President-elect Donald Trump breaks protocol by accepting a phone call from Taiwan's leader. South Korea votes to impeach its president, and fake news is becoming a global problem with very real consequences. We'll discuss these stories and more. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. Donald Trump breaks with diplomatic protocol to take a telephone call from Taiwan. But first, the battle for Aleppo. Joining us in our studio is Yunan Zhang, Chief U.S. Correspondent for Tsai Shi Media. From New York, we're joined by Raza Rumi, a Pakistani journalist and political commentator. With us from Beirut is Anna Therese Day, an award-winning journalist and Fulbright Fellow. Also with us in the studio is Syed Arokat. Syed is the Washington Bureau Chief of Al-Quds Daily. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Anna, let's start with the situation in Syria. Government forces, backed by Russian air power, have largely prevailed. Are we seeing the endgame in this civil war in Syria?
If Assad's forces retake eastern Aleppo, it will certainly be a major tactical and symbolic defeat for the rebels. However, we have to remember that Assad only controls a third of his country at this point. He does not control the entire east, which still has an ISIS stronghold, the northeast, which has a large Kurdish separatist population, and then other swaths that the opposition control. Another note is that Assad's Syrian Arab army make up only a minority of the coalition fighting for East Aleppo right now. So if Assad's foreign backers change their mind or feel any fatigue about this nearly 6-year war, Assad does not have the security capacity to stabilize his own country.
Syed, with government forces taking over control of large parts of Aleppo, how much of a defeat is this for United States foreign policy? Because what we've been hearing in Washington throughout the civil war is that Assad must go, and we are backing the rebels.
Yeah, well, for sure, definitely it's a defeat for the stated goal of the United States, because early on they came, and I believe wrongly so, stating that Assad must go and his days were numbered and so on, without really laying out a plan to bring that this goal into fruition or to achieve that goal. So that was wrong to begin with, because they focused on the person of Assad rather than a larger strategy. They were almost became painted into a corner. But I want to take issue with the numbers on the Syrian. I think the large part of those who are fighting for Aleppo are really the Syrian army. Now, you know, Hezbollah may have like a brigade size fighting alongside the Syrian army. The Russians may be giving, advisors and so on. So does Iran and so on. But the bulk of the fighting has been done by the Assad forces, the Syrian army. That's one. Second, it is a major thing because it is the last metropolitan area, the last big urban area that is under the control of the rebels. So when that falls, it's a major, let's say, stride towards not necessarily ending the civil war, but towards achieving a tremendous victory for the Syrian army. They will continue to fight in the Latakia countryside and the Homs countryside and the Hama countryside, but in the urban areas, the fight will regress tremendously.
Yunan, China joined Russia at the United Nations Security Council earlier this week and vetoed that resolution which called for a ceasefire in Aleppo to allow aid to get through. What is China's position on what is going on in Syria right now?
The official stance of the Chinese government is that the Syria issue needs a political solution. And I think the Chinese people, from what I read online, they're actually supportive of the China's veto against this ceasefire resolution. Their point is they think there's still a lot of disagreement between the parties. And now have a ceasefire will allow the rebels to have more time to regroup and to strengthen. And that would not benefit the Syrians and will not end this war soon.
Right, but clearly we're looking at a military victory here for Bashar al-Assad's forces. Is China looking beyond that to some kind of negotiated solution to the long term in the country?
Yes, I think they will look to the long term, and I think from them, they will think before the United States and Russia can rebuild some mutual respect and trust towards each other, there will not be a solution that can sustain the ceasefire.
Raza, Pakistan has long maintained an alliance with Bashar al-Assad. In fact, many Pakistani volunteers were recruited by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards to fight on the side of Bashar al-Assad in the civil war. Why this support for Assad from Pakistan?
Well, I think officially Pakistan has been trying to remain kind of neutral in this. Pakistan did oppose the U.S. sort of intervention earlier when the civil war broke out. But a lot of these volunteers who have gone to Syria are not officially sponsored. They are largely a good number of Pakistani students are studying in seminaries in Iraq and Iran, and they are often recruited to fight the rebels in Syria and the ISIS, most importantly. And then, because I don't know if you know that Pakistan has the second largest Shiite population after Iran. And so there is also a kind of a sectarian religious angle to that. A lot of these fighters want to go and strengthen Assad, whom they see as pitted against ISIS, which is trying to kill the Shiite in both Iraq and Syria. So I think it's more like that. And Pakistan has tried to play a fine balancing act, not to be too partisan, but certainly I think while it must be acknowledged that Assad is brutal and he has perpetrated many a crime against his own people, but you know, I think external interventions rarely help. And in this case, what Syria needs is a functional state before anything else can begin.
Okay, let's move on to our next topic, and that is President-elect Donald Trump. Yunnan, he made that, or rather took that telephone call from the Taiwan leader just a few days ago, breaking with protocol, as we've been saying. Basically, to what extent did he undermine the one China policy that the United States has been following for decades?
I think the current U.S. administration has been clear that the U.S. government stands by the one China policy, and we haven't heard anything from the Trump the team about this policy. But what I think is it is too soon to judge whether it is a policy change or not. And from, I think the Trump team, what they're doing is kind of sending a mixed signal. For the one thing, they took the call from the Taiwan leader, Tsai Ing-wen. But at the same time, recently, he appoints Terry Branstad as the new ambassador to China, who is considered as an old friend to China. So that suggests that he might want to have a friendly relationship with China and understands how important it is for this bilateral relationship to succeed. And recently, the former U.S. Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, said he was very impressed by the calm reaction from the Chinese leadership about this phone call, which suggests their determination to see whether it is possible to have a calm dialogue between the two parties. So I think for the Chinese part, they're wait to see whether is there an actual policy change.
Wait. Raza, China's Global Times newspaper said that these actions by Trump and the words that he's been saying have been reckless. That's the quote that the Global Times used, reckless, and they must be met head on, the newspaper said. Are we looking at renewed tensions here between China and the United States, or will we see cooler heads prevail once, you know, President-elect Trump becomes President Trump?
Well, I'm quite sure that cooler heads will prevail, and Mr. Trump is not going to make many radical changes to, you know, what the U.S. policy has been for decades now. But certainly he does have his own signature style, and before he formally takes over and the new administration sort of starts governing, Mr. Trump is sending a signal that he has his own style of doing things, and perhaps that may lead to some minor changes, but I don't foresee a major change. However, in the long run, the U.S.-China competition over power globally is bound to increase. I mean, that is one kind of fact of life, the way it is panning out, because China is a rising power. And the U.S. power, even a lot of U.S. thinkers and experts say, is declining in so many ways. So, and Mr. Trump also has a very clear sort of isolationist policy when it comes to global affairs. So it really remains to be seen how this plays out. But I think in the short to medium term, I don't foresee any major change.
Sid, what is your view on this?
Well, I think this calm reaction is because while Mr. Trump may have broken with practice, he did not break with policy. But I believe this calm reaction will change dramatically if, as alleged, President Tsai Ing-wen comes to America, because there is apparently some plans for her to come to the United States, and she might meet with the president-elect before inauguration on 20th of January. If that happens, I think that the reaction, the Chinese reaction, will be entirely different. They are already calling on the United States not to give her a visa to come to come to New York and so on and meet with the president-elect. I think Mr. Trump is utilizing an old-fashioned negotiating tool, that he's leveraging what he has, perhaps trying to extract whatever concessions from China. I don't think it will work in the long term. China is just too important a partner with the United States, and ultimately this policy that is in practice now has been best for both China and the United States, and this is likely to continue.
That's right, it has been referred to as the most important relationship in the world right now. But to Yunan's point about what Henry Kissinger said about this, that he was impressed with the calm response of the Chinese government, he also said that he thinks that China is looking to develop what he called a calm dialogue with the new incoming U.S. administration.
Indeed, because this relationship is far too important and involves everything from trade to money to debts and so on, to conflict in the South China Sea. All these things come into play, and it has to remain on a steady course. Otherwise, there's going to be a major crisis globally.
Okay, we are going to take a break right now. Coming up, we'll discuss the impeachment of President Park Geun-hye in South Korea and the real impact of fake news. Stay with us, you're watching The Heat. Welcome back to The Heat. Hoaxes and fake news going viral across the globe before the truth can catch up. What effect is it having on impressionable people around the world? But first, South Korea's lawmakers have voted to impeach President Park Geun-hye. Let's get back to our panel to talk about that. The country's National Assembly has voted to impeach the president in South Korea. This is an important country. It's the region's fourth largest economy. What kind of impact is it going to have in the region?
I think, first of all, it will have an impact on the domestic politics on South Korea itself, that in 60 days they will need to elect a new president. And because of this change of power, it will have an impact on the region. For example, at the end of the year, the China, South Korea, and Japan trilateral summit might be postponed. And also, we don't know, for example, whether the deployment of that will be delayed as well. So for many Chinese people, President Park they're very familiar with the stories of President Park, and she's the first female president of South Korea. And a lot of people expressed that they like President Park, but they would like to see she agreed to the deployment of that in South Korea. And in the short term, people might think, oh, it is a good news that might change, and this might be postponed.
But it's still up to the Constitutional Court to uphold that decision to impeach her, right?
Yes.
And if that is upheld, then there will be elections. What are the chances of more left-leaning parties getting into power? I
think it's pretty likely. And for China, I think it might be a good news in the long term, and they want to develop the relationship with South Korea within the region. For example, maybe negotiate a free trade agreement with South Korea and Japan. So we don't know. We need to see whether this will have a good news for China in the long term.
Okay, let's get back to Anna in Beirut. And Anna, the Wall Street Journal here in the United States has taken a bit of a global view on what is going on in South Korea. It says that public anger against Ms. Park has some of the flavor of these populist uprisings that we're seeing here in the United States, as well as in a number of countries in Europe. And these uprisings are against entrenched political and economic interests. Do you think that is the case here?
Certainly that is a trend that we're seeing around the world, but of course there is legitimate criticism, particularly on the grounds of human rights, press freedom. It looks like one of the leading contenders to replace Ms. Park is a former labor activist, a former political prisoner, a student activist. So with a candidate like that, of course, that could be a positive signal in terms of human rights.
Say, this impeachment, this could have effects, consequences far beyond South Korea's borders, couldn't it? Because South Korea has a close relationship with the United States. As Yunan was saying, there is plans to deploy an anti-missile system there. Donald Trump has been making noise about South Korea, saying that it has to take more responsibility for its defenses. So how does this complicate things?
Really, as far as U.S.-South Korean relations, it will not change much. Look, the Americans have had 30,000 troops along one of the most dangerous zones or lines in the world for the better part of 60 years or 62, 63 years. That is not likely to change. The North Korean sort of reckless, in the American view, development of intercontinental ballistic missiles that can carry conceivably nuclear warheads is real threat. So that relationship will continue. But domestically, it will have a lot of impact. Aside from like a scandal that harkens back to the days of Rasputin and the Tsarina and so on, back at the turn of the 20th century. This is a conservative leader who's alienated a lot of segments of society. So we are likely to see this thing move forward. I understand it's going to be a two-judge panel ultimately that will decide this thing. So we are likely to see probably the presidency go to a more liberal person. But on the issues of trade, on the issues of national security and so on, things are likely to remain the same with the United States.
Rosa, a lot happening on the Korean Peninsula. In the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, of course, there have been missile tests, there have been nuclear weapons tests, there's talk of the THAAD missile system being deployed in South Korea. Now there could be an election in the country. So is there a big question mark now over the future direction of South Korea?
Well, I think the foreign policy part or the regional stability part, I don't see that there's going to be any major impact on that. But certainly, I think it's a great thing that South Korea and and the population is exerting a public pressure for transparency and openness. And I think that is a very welcome development because, as an earlier panelist said, that it's going to improve both the human rights situation, but also kind of a more open style of governance. And that is what we see, that when countries achieve high levels of economic growth and prosperity, then the next step is to the quest for transparency and political freedoms. So I think it is in that way quite interesting. But the country where I come from, Pakistan, we also have a similar public pressure going on against the incumbent Prime Minister for his involvement in the Panama leaks story. So it's kind of a global trend at the moment. People are challenging the established orders and incumbent politicians for their alleged corruption or misdoings, etc. At the same time, they also want a kind of a changed political structure where their sort of aspirations are better articulated.
Okay, let's get to the final topic in our journalist roundtable, and that is fake news. Used to be known as dishonest news or lies or whatever. It's now called fake news. Syed, you're a journalist with a big, influential newspaper. Recently, we've seen this wave of fake news stories, mainly on social media. Yeah. What is it doing to the practice of journalism? Is it threatening everybody? It's threatening all our credibility?
Absolutely. I think, I mean, I came face to face to it last Sunday. I was driving down Connecticut when the Comet Pizza thing happened. So it is really real. People believe in these conspiracy theories. I think it did impact the elections. It has gone from way the fringe into mainstream, so to speak. So we were seeing that the right side, for instance, the right side media now, or what is called Trump News, will be in the briefing room in the White House and so on. Breitbart is planting. I mean, this story was initially planted by Breitbart and so on, allegedly. So this is a big deal, and people really have to be careful. And I think that it will be taken seriously. We saw the former Democratic nominee, Hillary Clinton, speak about it very passionately on Thursday night. So it is a big deal, and it will impact the way we report as journalists, how you are going to sort of, wade through this avalanche, especially on social media, of fake news that people believe, and, that conspiracy theories that are tied with one another. It's not just one. It is like a cobweb of conspiracy theories and so on that actually appeal to people that at the end of the day went out and voted for Mr. Trump, let's say, in the so-called Rust Belt and others and so on, because they do have a great deal of mistrust of what they call the mainstream media and the United States government.
Anna, there is very little, and in some instances no control over some of the websites that publish these fake news stories. There is some control in places like Facebook or Twitter, but how does one sift fake news from the real news in today's world?
It's going to be an enormous challenge, and as your guest mentioned, it certainly impacted the election, and I would say on a larger level, I think it's impacted the entire political discourse of what's acceptable in mainstream American politics. So this has been incredibly troubling. However, as we've really kind of unpacked what we saw during this crazy election cycle, we've seen that this is a profitable industry on the internet. And I find that very troubling as a journalist, because how do you start regulating that? Another troubling development that we saw is kind of pressures with censorship. The Washington Post came out with an article about fake news, and it was very widely circulated. But not long after it was circulated, one of the key think tanks that it mentioned in its group was kind of disproven as a legitimate source. It came out as somewhat anti-Russia. And even Washington Post, which is something that people want, a news outlet that people wanted to trust, did some excellent investigative reporting during the election. So I really feel now we must all be vigilant and also very careful, even with this new kind of tendency towards censorship, to make sure we're not trying to just censor certain opinions that do still deserve a place in the mainstream discourse.
Right, and as Anna says, there were a number of fake news stories that did the rounds during this last presidential election campaign on both sides. Are we seeing this kind of phenomenon in other parts of the world as well? I mean, does it happen in China?
Yes, I would say this phenomenon is not unique in the United States. For example, in China, sometimes when we see some fake news are trending on social media, we would actually write a story on our website to tell people why that is not true. That is our way to counter the fake news. But I understand here it's on a different level, it's on a different scale. Like the former Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton mentioned, it is an epidemic in this country. And we see, just as Anna mentioned, that people own multiple news websites, fake news websites, as businesses. And also some people are suggesting that it is influenced by foreign propaganda. So I think we need to understand where the problems are rooted in, and then try to solve this problem. Secretary Clinton mentioned a federal legislation, but we don't know what exactly that will be. And also Silicon Valley are trying to combat this problem too.
But that must be difficult as a journalist, because if you start writing about fake news, you run the risk of giving credibility to that, right?
Yes. So for journalists, we're extra careful, cautious to verify our stories, to talk to the sources, even though sometimes we might publish story later than other news websites, but we will make sure that it's a true story.
Raza, how does one guard against fake news as a consumer of news? And to what extent, I mean, can we blame the mainstream media for this? Because if we look at, let's say, cable news here in the United States, it's moved largely from being a source of objective, real news to one of just being opinions right now. You know, people sitting around a table just giving off their opinions. It's become an incubator for all kinds of ideas now rather than for hard news. So to what extent is that responsible for the rise of fake news sites all over the place?
Well, I mean, I think this is actually just the kind of symptom of the larger problem that the media here in US has been undergoing. So after this election, even the mainstream corporate media kind of stands further discredited because they could not really look at how the election results would turn, and they were not in touch with people, particularly in the rural areas or small towns, which showed completely opposite trends from what the pundits on these roundtables you mentioned were articulating day in and day out. So I think that has to, but coming back to the fake news syndrome, I think the real problem that we have is, yes, there is no way to check and regulate the internet. Yes, there can be some filters, but the problem we have here is that Facebook is a giant, and that is what people mostly go to. Data shows that most people in the US, for example, go to Facebook, especially the young people. And even Facebook has been trending and posting fake stories because, it does not really have proper editors, and it is all mechanized, and bots are handling that. So I think Facebook has to really change its model, and this huge control over the dissemination and distribution of news, even from mainstream media, is a problem because it is further making media monopolies stronger. And finally, I mean, I think the word epidemic has been used by Secretary Clinton, and there's a Stanford study which shows that 80% of the middle school kids could not differentiate between fake and verified news or handles, and one in four high school students can't really tell that difference. So it is a major challenge of our times, and I think social media is an area we need to focus.
Yeah, it's happening among adults as well. Let's get to our final segment in the show, and that is the next big story. Anna, what's the next big story we should be looking for?
I think we need to keep our eyes on Syria. As we all discussed at the beginning, we have differing opinions on it, but I do see this as perhaps entering a new phase that we all need to be vigilant in watching on behalf of civilians. So I encourage everyone to keep their eyes on Syria.
So what's going to be grabbing the headlines?
I think how many renegade electors we're going to have during the meeting of the Electoral College. That's one. And the second one is really the appointment of the Secretary of State. Who's going to be that Secretary of State? So I think we will focus on these two issues in the coming week or so.
Yeah, I like the way they refer to those electors called faithless electors. Yonan, what's the next big story?
I would agree that the Secretary of State is a very important position, especially when China and the US are experiencing this transition period, and the two parties need to have a calm dialogue. So I think we need a calm Secretary of State to handle that issue.
Raza, what's the next big story in your book?
Yeah, I mean, I was about to say that, but I think everybody said that the Secretary of State and the next sort of outlandish appointment. So in general, I think that's what's going to hit the headlines.
And I guess that will also give us a good idea of the direction US foreign policy is going to take, whomever becomes
Precisely.
that. Right?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.